It's my pleasure. My name is Ann Milgram. I am NYU Law School class of 1996, and my most important claim to fame here, and the fact that I get to moderate these two amazing people. I'm also a professor of practice at the law school. So today we have two extraordinary individuals, and I'm really honored to be here with them. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're just going to jump in and start the conversation. We'll go for a little bit less than an hour, and then we'll open it to questions. So we'll have about 20 minutes of Q&A before we break. And obviously, there's going to be a lot to cover. Not to mention that we are very excited that we're celebrating the release of Professor Rachel Barkow's new book, Prisoners of Politics, which we will have available after. And I'll remind you of that at the end, because we're going to talk, I think, a lot about the book today. Let me introduce Professor Barkow. Rachel Barkow is the Siegel Family Professor of Regulatory Law and Policy. She's also someone who's been both a scholar in the criminal justice space and also a practitioner in some ways. She sat on the Sentencing Commission for about 5 years, going off of January of this year. And she's written an enormous amount on criminal justice and criminal justice reform in America. And we also have, and of course she has this amazing book that's just come out. We also have with us today Shaun King, and I think I speak for all of us in saying it's really a privilege and an honor, Shaun, to have you join us and be a part of this conversation. One of the most amazing things I learned about you is that Time magazine said that you are one of the 25 most influential people on the internet, which is an extraordinary thing.
It's a big internet.
That's a big, that's what I was thinking.
Right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, what do you have to do to be...
Donald Trump is also on that list. So
you're keeping it real.
Yeah, it all balances out in some kind of way.
Understood. So Shaun, he's also the CEO of the North Star, which of course is the paper that Frederick Douglass had published for many years. He is the co-founder of the Real Justice PAC, which is working to elect progressive prosecutors. He's a columnist for The Intercept and of course started as a journalist. And really, I think, is just one of the most prominent voices for criminal justice reform in America today. And so it's an honor to have both of you here for this conversation. I'm going to... we should stop now because they love you. So, Rachel, I'm going to start with you because you really wanted Shaun to be a part of our conversation. And so I think maybe just explain to folks here why it was important to you to have Shaun be a part of this conversation about your new book.
Oh, sure. Thank you, because that gives me an opportunity to say thank you for coming. I think one of the things that Shaun has been able to do uniquely, really, in terms of voices that are out there, is get what's really happening on the ground in criminal justice out to a lot of people to see things that are actually happening, as opposed to just the media portrayals of crime and justice in America that have dominated for so long. So you turn on the evening news, and you guys maybe not watching the evening news so much anymore, but there's still an enormous demographic who gets their news that way. And every night it's a crime story, no matter what, there is a crime story. It's a third of all local newscasts. So you never get a sense of whether crime is rising, falling, what's being done to actually do a good job. It's just whatever the most horrific story they can find. And it usually tends to paint whoever the person who committed the crime in just the worst possible light, the grislier the better. And that's really been the imagery that I think has dominated the landscape in the United States, and it's led to all kinds of consequences, how people vote, what politicians say, what they do. And I think one of the things that Shaun has been able to do is break through that and show another side of the story that frankly isn't getting covered in the same way, is not getting the same kind of attention. Even if you think about the way that Ferguson and Ferguson's aftermath was focused, or any other incidents where the police are shooting someone, you could compare the kind of coverage you would get in a mainstream publication, lots of police quotations, lots of perspectives from law enforcement sources, but you don't really get the whole story from that. And I think one thing that you've been able to do is show people a much richer picture of what's actually happening. And unfortunately, I don't think there's enough people out there that do that and have been able to break through. And I think some of it is just, you're uniquely talented. And I don't know how to get that message broader. But one of the things I think there's two things. So that's one. And then the second is that Sean has also been at the forefront of what I think has been one of the most effective criminal justice movements that we've had recently, which is the election of prosecutors around the country who are pursuing progressive to get prosecutors elected around the country who are pursuing a more progressive agenda, that are focused on getting real results instead of just rhetoric of toughness, and focusing on things that the system has been doing wrong. And he has started a PAC to get those prosecutors elected and has been very successful doing so. So kind of those two things together, both navigating the political sphere to get people elected, but also kind of cutting through that media bias, I would say, are two reasons.
So Sean, I'm going to give you a chance to answer that, but
Sure.
I want you to also just sort of tell us, because I think Rachel's done a great job of talking about the extraordinary influence you have today. But when's the moment in time, like you started off as a writer, what's the moment in time where you become an activist, where you start to realize the power of this?
Well, I almost have to tell two stories to tell one. I'm 39 years old, and I started undergrad in 1997. And so I grew up in rural Kentucky and moved to Atlanta to go to Morehouse College in 1997. And so I was student government. I was very much an activist and an organizer as a student on campus, organizing around the issue of police brutality, police violence. This is 22 years ago. Then we were organizing around the disparities between crack and powder cocaine sentencing. And I was student government president in 1999, and that winter was when a young man named Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times on the doorstep of his home here in the Bronx. And this is pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook, this almost pre-internet. It was definitely, this was like during the age of dial-up and AOL, and it was hard in the 90s. If you cared about an issue, whatever that issue was, it was hard to find other people who cared about it because there was no social media for you to find the voices, for you to find the groups, for you to find the people who shared the common affinity with you. But there were so many of us that were crushed and outraged by what happened to Amadou that a group of us, college students from all over Atlanta, traveled to New York, most of us for the very first time, to protest and organize around that. After I graduated Morehouse, I was a high school history and civics teacher for a few years. And then for several years, this was before probably anybody in the room knew me, I worked for over 3 years in Atlanta's jails and prisons as a traveling teacher. I would go from youth detention center to jail to prison all over, and I was a contract teacher teaching teenagers who had all been convicted as adults, but because of state law, they were still required to get an education. And so I would travel from place to place and be a teacher in those places. And it was there that I was teaching 15 classes a week, 5 days a week, that I got an up close and personal view of what the system, the justice system really looked like. But, so that's a bit of my personal story. But I really moved away from that. I got married. I had kids, a lot of kids. I have 5 kids. And most of my life was about being a husband, being a father, paying the bills. And I moved out of Atlanta and took a job in Southern California at a great charity called Global Green. And it's an environmental charity. And I was the director of communications for this charity, and that was for the national office. And in 2014, I was living in Southern California, working at Global Green, and there was one pivotal moment that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I wrote for my student newspaper when I was an undergrad, but I got married when I was an undergrad. By the way, if you want to get through law school successfully, you might want to hold off on having babies. If you think law school is hard now, and there are a few of you who are balancing both, and you could take the mic and explain to everybody. If you think law school is hard now, do it with a baby, and you'll find out just how hard it really is. And so I dropped my dream of being a journalist, and even in some way dropped a lot of the work that I did as an organizer. But everybody who knew me from college always knew me as Sean the activist, Sean the organizer. And so every few months for my entire adult life, before 2014, people would always message me and say, Sean, will you take a look at this? Can you say something about this? In 2006, I got a message like that, and there was a young man in New York named Sean Bell who was shot 50 times on his wedding day, hours before his wedding, unarmed, nonviolent, beautiful young man, engaged, they had a baby. It was just a horrible story. And for years, once or twice a year, I would fight back against police brutality. But in 2014, that's not what I was doing. And I got a message, a Facebook message from a buddy of mine who lived in New York. And I have a book coming out. Maybe, Rachel, you'll be at my book event.
Oh, yes.
But I tell this story in the book because it's so random, but it changed my entire life. He said, Sean, he said, there's a video on YouTube, and it had just been uploaded the day before. You have to realize so much has changed in this country since 2014. Politically, of course, but there was no Facebook Live, there was no Instagram Live. You couldn't even upload videos on most social media platforms. And there was a video that a man named Ramsey Orta had posted on YouTube, and it had not gone viral. There had never been a viral video of someone being killed by police. On that day, this was July 17th, I'm at my desk, and my friend sends me this link, and he says, Sean, there's a middle-aged black man on a street corner in New York, and he's being harassed by the police, and he's begging the police to leave him alone. And he said, Sean, an officer comes up behind the man and begins choking him and wrestles him to the ground and continues to choke him. And he said, Sean, the man's on the ground, and you can hear the man yelling out, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And I hadn't clicked on the link yet, and my friend said, Sean, the guy dies right there on the sidewalk. He said, then he dies, and they turn him around and handcuff him, and they're poking at him, asking him to get up. And he said, the man is dead. So I'm at my cubicle, and if any of you know what it's like to be in a space where you don't know what the people around you are going to think about something that you might be looking at, I didn't even know if I wanted to click on the link. And I clicked on it, and it was the man that we eventually came to know as Eric Garner being harassed by the police, as was regular for him. He had filed multiple complaints against the police, and he was choked to death right there. And I was 35 at the time, but I had never seen a living man choked to death with my own eyes. I'd seen movies where action heroes do these things, but to see it and know that it just happened the day before, I was so shook up by it. And the only thing, Rachel, your thoughts about what I try to do and what I tried to do in that moment, the only thing I knew to do, if you've ever been to LA, the traffic in Los Angeles is horrible. It took me almost 2 hours to drive home. And the whole way home, I was thinking, who am I going to call? What am I going to do? I knew what I just saw was wrong. And I got home, and I posted that video on my personal Facebook page. I was a leader, but I didn't have verified accounts or public pages or anything like that. And what I tried to do, Rachel, is what I've tried to do thousands of times since. I just tried to tell the story of what I thought happened there. And by that next day, that story that I posted was viral, and I literally never worked at Global Green again. They paid me for a few more paychecks. And we had this weird understanding that I was doing something important that I shouldn't be paid for by them. But I resigned a few weeks later, not knowing how I was going to provide for my family. 3 weeks later, I got another email that a man named John Crawford had been shot and killed at a Walmart by police in Ohio, unarmed, nonviolent, wonderful young man. And then the next day, I learned of a town called Ferguson that I'd never heard before, as it was happening, I had a friend who was looking at a live stream video of a teenage boy laying on the ground, blood flowing down the street. And in those moments, in those 3 weeks between Eric Garner, John Crawford, and Mike Brown being killed, a part of what happened was I found a niche of telling these stories from the perspective of victims, of families, of community members. Because when I would click on any of the mainstream stories or watch the news, those stories were never told from that perspective. And over the past 5 years, I've written going on 2,000 stories of injustice and police violence in the United States and all over the world. And so I've tried to be a bit of a documentarian in that sense, but I only wrote those stories, and I'll close the loop with it on this. My only purpose for ever writing those stories was to hope that writing them could affect change. And it took me a few years to realize that every blue moon writing a story can affect change. Right. But it more than likely doesn't affect change. Sharing a video won't affect change, more than likely. But that the criminal justice system is so amazingly complicated and is so stacked against the people who are incarcerated or brutalized by the system that change would have to be seen from a very different perspective. And that's what I love about Rachel's book, is it acknowledges that this system is far more complex than we often want to admit it really is. And our solutions to changing it have to be equally as sophisticated as the problem itself. And so I continue to write, but I now spend more of my time trying to fight for changes and reform even than I do writing.
So this is a perfect chance to come back to you, Rachel, because I think, and I'll let you say this, and you'll say it much more articulately in your own words, but one of the central themes of your book is that it's called The Prisoners of Politics, right? And it's basically saying one of the problems, the huge problems in criminal justice, is this structural problem of the way politics has influenced the entire system. So Sean, I think, presents a really interesting example of a counterbalance to the prevailing politics of incarceration and fear, that we always want people to be incarcerated because of fear. What's your view? And you talk a lot about data and infrastructure and changing the infrastructure, but I think it would be great to hear you talk about the ideas that you have for changing the infrastructure and how Sean's work and that type of politics could be helpful, right? Or you sort of have this thesis about politics, but Sean is, I think, a really interesting counterbalance to pushing back on existing politics that we've lacked.
Yeah, no, so I appreciate that question, actually, because we'll never get away from politics. That's how we run our country. I mean, it's all of us. We vote for people. And I think what I'm hoping to do in the book is when people see videos like that, when people get a closer look at what's actually happening in terms of the administration of criminal law in America, and they're upset by it, or they're upset by mass incarceration or racial disparities, that gets channeled into the right political action. And so I think right now, and so I do think there's a way in which you could take what you're seeing and then say, oh, how do we fix that? What should we do? How could we mobilize? And I think, so one space would be thinking about electing progressive prosecutors. So if you're in a community and you don't like the way the prosecutions have gone in your community, you're angry because they haven't brought charges against officers who've killed unarmed civilians, or you're angry because they're treating juveniles like adults, or you're angry because they have too much pretrial detention, whatever it is that they're doing that you don't like, the idea is to mobilize the people who live in those communities and vote for somebody better. And I think, that's an example of taking the politics and having it work for better outcomes. Now, so this is the pessimist in me, though, says, okay, so that'll work in certain cities where there's a group of people that really do care about those issues, and they're very focused on them, and they're engaged, and these are kind of low turnout elections, usually prosecutor elections. And so if you had a group of engaged citizens, you could really affect change. It gets so much harder as we move further down the line for electing people. So thinking about electing statewide offices, now you're thinking about, okay, it's not just people in one urban area that have been affected by criminal law in a variety of different ways, but people who maybe have no direct experience with it at all. And it's just what they're watching on Fox News every night and what it leads them to want to do. Or national office holders, same kind of thing. It just gets harder to think about how you're going to use the politics and movement politics to get change affected in those other spaces. And so my hope is to show that, yes, keep working on getting people who are active where you can make change directly and vote people in who believe in all these policies for sure. But the other is when you have people in positions who want to do something and care about the issues, get them to focus on the kinds of changes that will be lasting and that are the kind of institutional structural shifts that I think will move us in a better direction and have some sticking power. So just the quick example I would say is, you could say, yes, let's lower the sentence for crime X, which, depending on the crime, I'm probably all for. We'd have to look and see what it was, but because sentences are probably too high for whatever it is, but we don't have to look and see. But then the next person that gets elected can just change that right back. And we see that all the time in American politics. And so the kinds of things that I try to point out in the book would be the kinds of changes that outlast that one election cycle to another. So you put in institutional fixes. And so it would be things like, maybe you put a cap on the amount of prison space you're going to have in your jurisdiction. And then from that, you force people to think about how you actually want to allocate those limited resources. Or, you have an actor within your state that's responsible for criminal justice policies explaining why the costs are outweighed by the benefits. And, they have judicial review. And some of this stuff may sound like wonky and weird, but that's what we do with everything else in our society that we care about. When we care about health and we care about safety in other spaces, we try to maximize it by doing that. And here we're talking about public safety, right? So we should be wanting better public safety outcomes. And I think one of the weird perversities of American criminal justice policy making is we pursue all these policies that people claim are, tough, but tough on what? They're tough on communities, they're tough on people. They're not actually tough on crime. They're terrible. They don't work to reduce crime. And so we get the worst of all worlds. And so the hope would be to shift to a model where we actually look for the pathways that would get us better outcomes on all those metrics, which, it sounds, and I'm not like a snake oil salesperson here, like we know this from empirical data, like we have evidence that there are better ways to approach things. And so that's my hope, is that to the extent, people get mobilized through Sean's writings and the writings of others who get them engaged in these things, to then figure out what should your ask be? Like, what do you want at the end of this? And the hope would be start asking for some bigger institutional fixes that I think will last. And the last little footnote to all this I will just say is, we did not get mass incarceration because there was like some central planner in a room that said, let's have more than 2 million people incarcerated. It was lots of little decisions along the way by lots of different people, not really thinking about whether they made sense or not, honestly, that together created this. And so it's going to take some careful doing to dismantle all of that. And so one way to think about it is a better institutional structure.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah. I think some of what we have to, and it's what I love about Rachel's book, is that we have to be willing to be imaginative about how we solve some of our most complicated problems. And when we grow to finally accept that the criminal justice system, it didn't create itself. It was, as Rachel said, built piece by piece, policy by policy, person by person. And there are so many books that I would love for you to read. I think the most recent book, in addition to Rachel's, that I really love is one that just won the Pulitzer Prize called Locking Up Our Own.
Big second to that one.
Yeah, right. And it's because I think it's a good complement to the new Jim Crow in the sense that Locking Up Our Own, which is written by James Forman Jr., a brilliant professor at Yale Law School, honestly details the role of two groups of people that have, by and large, gotten off for their part in creating the system of mass incarceration. First group of people is the Democratic Party. And it deals extensively. It's easy and it's a cop-out, but it's actually dangerous to pit the problem of mass incarceration on conservatives. Because if you do that, it then gives you the impression that when you elect a Democrat, the problem will get solved. And what we found is that when we elected Barack Obama, that mass incarceration barely moved a fraction of an inch. Here and there, it got better, but in many metrics, it got worse. And if we operate from this kind of perspective that one political party created it, it'll give us the impression that if we elect somebody from the other party, that it'll solve the problem. And it's not true. And what James Forman deals with in the book is Democrats, their motivations for creating the system were often different, but it functionally had the same impact. And then the second community that he addresses, and it's a painful conversation, is how communities of color, but particularly local black leaders, including members of the Congressional Black Caucus, black mayors, black city councilmen, and others, out of a sincere desire to solve crime in black neighborhoods, to reduce drugs in black neighborhoods, agreed to things that ultimately kind of created the Frankenstein of mass incarceration. Not just agreed in theory, but often even campaigned for it, signed for it, and forced it into law. And we often say this phrase, and I hear it everywhere I go. I introduced Bernie Sanders at an event on Saturday, and I heard him say it. And I afterwards told him, don't say that again, because it's wrong. He said, the criminal justice system is broken. And I know what he meant when he said that. And that is almost true. But to say that it's broken would be to assume that it was a well-intentioned, well-functioning system, and it has somehow deviated from that, and that has never been true. The system is not broken. It's actually functioning exactly the way those who built it and designed it intended it to function. And that's a very different thought than it just being broken and us needing to patch it up. And so how you deconstruct such a system requires coalitions, unlike many that we really see right now, and it requires an imagination for us to say, let's be willing to dream and imagine what this should look like. I'll close with this. The very first article I ever wrote for the New York Daily News when I was there was an article about how sentences were created for certain crimes. And in all of my studies, I found that it was so arbitrary that sentences were created primarily because they were in multiples of 5 or 7. Just because those are the ways we like to count. And 7 because we have 7 days of the week. 5 is just a multiple that we use all the time. So you would see crimes would have 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. And when I would push people to say, how did you come up with 25 years? And why, and ultimately all I could really get to was that it just we like to count in multiples of 5. It's really? That's a primary framer of our system, that we count in 5s and 7s. And it's yep.
Doesn't this raise, I think, some issues for you, Rachel? One of the things I love about your book is talking about data and transparency, and I am a huge believer in evidence-based work. I also happen to think that there is, in some ways, it's hard to walk in and say, this is silly, we're doing 5 years because that's how we count, and we now have all these laws that are 20 years, 25 years, and for us to go in and push back with reform and serious institutional reform, We need the research to do it. And so you and I think, both talk a lot about data and research, but to me, there is a huge gap here where criminologists have not always studied what needs to be studied. You know, I'll give you one example, and then I want you to sort of speak to this, because I think Sean's point is a great point, and we're all now fighting against things that were arbitrary, but exist in the laws and in the criminal justice system. When I got to the Arnold Foundation, I wanted to understand what impact pretrial detention had on people who were incarcerated. So the question I was asking is, if you're in for 1 day versus 2 days versus 3 days, what does that do to you? What does that mean in terms of your life and your crime? And we could not find a single study. We did it ourselves. And that was about 3-4 years ago. And that's just an example to me of such an important core thing that we should all understand. Like, what impact does it have if we detain someone for 5 days? So how do we think about improving this space? Because to me, a lot of the reforms you want, I'm 100% in, but I don't know that we have all the research that we need yet, even though we have some good research.
No, I totally agree, and that I don't have all the answers, and I
I
still like
think
you to buy
you
the
and
book,
Sean
but you
do.
won't find all the answers in there. But what I do think is we should be asking those questions, and that is just not what we ask. Instead, if you think about, I'm just thinking of an example of the kind of dynamic that Sean is talking about. If you looked at how the United States set crack cocaine penalties initially, it was even worse than the multiples of 5. It was like an auction. Well, I'll see your 5, let's make it 10. No, let's make that mandatory minimum 20 years. And it was each party, Democrats and Republicans, trying to show who could be tougher. And if you look, there's quotes from legislators saying, we had no idea what we were doing. It wasn't based on anything. And they'll tell you that. It's not like there's any kind of even pretend argument behind it. And so I guess what I would say is, now that we know we have laws like that on the books, we know that's how our sentences were made. The question is, what do we do going forward? And we could start asking questions about those. Do those sentences deter people? Do those sentences rehabilitate people after they have served their time? Do those sentences look anything like proportionate punishment based on what someone has done? And you could then analyze what we do know to answer some of those questions. We actually do have answers to some of those questions now. We know those sentences are not deterring people. For the longer amount of time we're putting people into prison, there's a White House study that shows for every additional year, they're more likely to recidivate, right? We're keeping them away from social networks in their communities for longer periods, and it's harder when they come back out. And so it's having the opposite effect, we know, at a certain tipping point for sure. Now, you're right, we have to figure out exactly, where to set those things, but the amazing thing is we never even set these things asking those questions in the first place. It was very much kind of like gut reaction, moral intuition. And I think people had a sense that you could do that with punishment because somehow that's all it was doing. It was just, well, what's your just desert? What do you deserve for things? But that's not what we're doing. We have a public safety agenda. We're supposed to be making communities safer. We're supposed to be improving people's lives. And our scheme doesn't do that. I mean, can you imagine if we decided that's how we were going to do our drug policy? Well, let's just set those multiples of 5. It'll be 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams. People would say you're nuts because the whole idea is we're supposed to maximize public health. So what should we do? We should study different dosages and see what happens as we raise it, as we lower it. We should do the same thing when we're thinking about using prisons. You mentioned James' book, which is one of my students here know how much I love that book. And he has a great quote in there where he talks about how, you try anything else in criminal law and people will say, oh, that didn't work. We tried to put this person in a drug treatment program the first time and, it didn't work, so we can't try it again. And he says in the book, no one ever says that about prison. No one ever says the failure of prison to work is not a reason to try more prison. And that's pretty much what we've been doing. Decade after decade, crime after crime, place after place. This very failed paradigm, but just more of it. And so I do think we have to get away from that assumption that it's doing something. There's a sense that it's deterring or it's incapacitating with no awareness that there is this enormous trade-off. 95% of the people who are incarcerated will come back out and rejoin their communities. And the question is, have they been made better off when they do it? And the answer we find is no. We're not helping people. We're not lifting people up when they come back in. And we are additionally to doing that creating a public safety risk as a result of that. So it's both, fundamentally racially unjust and unequal, and it raises all kinds of questions questions about distribution, but also public safety. And so, I think that's where I think we could build these coalitions that Sean is talking about, because I don't see this as like left, right, people who want safety versus people who, want to sit in a circle and be nice to each other. This is like, there's a common goal that really should unite people, which is we are getting the worst of all worlds, and we could be better across all of those things if we just started asking the kinds of questions you started us off with.
I was going to ask you both about Van Jones at CPAC. Do you want to touch on that? And just for everyone, Van Jones is a criminal justice reform leader. He started Cut 50, and last week he made a statement at the Conservative Political Action Committee where he said conservatives were the leaders of criminal justice reform. And there's been a huge amount of backlash. But I think to your point, Sean, it'd be great to hear you on the politics of Democrat-Republican.
Yeah, so Van is my friend, and it's hard when your friend says something dumb to critique them. So there were so many people critiquing what Van said that I just said nothing. Like, there was no need to say anything because everyone said it. I will say something that I think Van has done, and I spoke with Van about this multiple times, that I just couldn't do. I just couldn't, and it's probably a shortcoming on my part. When I saw that Van was willing to talk he's friends with Jared Kushner, and he was friends with Jared Kushner before Trump was elected. And this gets really weird really quick, but Jared Kushner and Ivanka raised funds for Democrats all over the tri-state area, and they are lifelong Democrats, and so whatever on that. But Van worked with them in those circles, and when I saw that Van was going to try to work with members of the Trump administration to advance criminal justice reform, I understood it. And I also knew that I couldn't do it and wouldn't do it. That I didn't have what it took to be at such a table and hold my tongue, function effectively. Like, I would be arrested by Secret Service, it would never happen, it just wouldn't happen. But it is true, back to even some of my original comments, that people who are incarcerated and affected by this system don't have the luxury of us fighting for justice reform only when Democrats are in higher office. It can't be that way. Like, there are people who need help today on the federal level. We'll just talk about that. Who need help, whose case needs to be addressed, and it's unfair to them for us to take 4 or 8 years off if we're Democrats because a Republican is now in the White House. And so Van saw an opportunity to fill a gap that he knew most of us just wouldn't want to fill. And some of the legislative changes that he's been able to advance, I wouldn't give them an A, a B, or a C. I mean, I would give them like a D+, C-. But that's, to be fair, that's most government bills that get, when they come out, very few of them are A+. Very few of them are A's or B's. So some of the change that he's fighting for, some of it has even some problematic elements, but there's some real people that have been impacted by it. But I think what happened, I know this as a speaker. I've traveled over the past 5 years alone to 44 states, and I've spoken in every environment possible. Sometimes you want to say something that you think the crowd or audience wants to hear, and I just think that there are some conservatives who have done some things for criminal justice reform. But to say that conservatives are the primary ones fighting and winning the battles, wildly inaccurate and grossly disrespectful to the thousands and thousands of people who don't fit that box, who are fighting for reforms and winning on many levels. And I can't tell you, I lost count of how many battles I've been fighting against primarily conservatives and Republicans for the most basic changes all over the country. Republicans just blocking every single thing we fight for, every opportunity they get. So to hear him lift up a couple of examples and say that, I just thought it was like a verbal flourish that kind of curried favor with the audience, but is factually untrue.
I know I want to get to questions in a couple of minutes, but one of the things, I want to talk to you both about Stephon Clark, and I want to sort of raise this issue, and maybe Rachel, you start us off, and then Sean, but I ran a police department. When I was AG, I ran the Camden, New Jersey Police Department. I believe very strongly that we have to have police in communities. I also am heartbroken by what I've seen, and what worries me, I look at this and I think I could see this happening again tomorrow or in 6 months or a year, and the three of us could be sitting here having the same exact conversation about an unarmed African American who didn't need to die, right? And so to me, this is a structural question that I want to pose to both of you of how do we get to a point, and this is, really brass tacks reform, but how do we get to a point where we are not in this position? Because what the AG did not surprise me, what the DA did not surprise me, what the police officers did not surprise me, and yet we have a result that should never come to pass. And so I'll start with you, Rachel, and then turn it to you, Sean.
Okay, I'm going to stay in my lane on this one and focus on, the spaces that I think institutionally where they fail. So one thing that I notice in these cases is you could sort of look and say, okay, I see the DA or the AG looking at all the facts here and the existing California law on the use of deadly force. I would have predicted that outcome, frankly, given all that together, and I get that. But at the same time, when I've seen other areas where DAs and AGs have been kind of hamstrung by the letter of the law, they have been leaders in saying, therefore, we need to fix the law. And one of the things in these cases that bothers me is there's a kind of way in which prosecutors will sometimes be out in the forefront saying, I am your leader in this community when it comes to public safety and thinking about public safety outcomes. And we had an unsafe citizen. We had a citizen who died. And so you would think that they should be out there as leaders saying, what can we do to prevent this in the future, as opposed to just saying, well, I looked at the facts of the case, the law is what it is, my hands are tied, this is terrible, and I feel bad for the family. That's not what they're doing when it comes to drug deaths or when they're talking about a homicide that's not at the hands of a police officer. They're thinking about, we need tougher sentences, we need to change the laws, and they lobby for it and they ask for it. And so I think it's, duplicity is going to be a harsh word to describe it, but I'll just say that there's just a way in which they're not seeing that that's also their responsibility to take the lead and say there's something wrong here and I should be part of the solution. If the law's not allowing me to deal with a situation like this, and we're seeing these shootings again and again and again, so we're not getting deterrence, we have a really big problem. In every other sphere, they would be leading the charge to change the law. Whereas here, they kind of are happy to sit back and just say, hey, I'm just a law enforcement, I just apply it, the law is what it is, my hands were tied. And so I think part of it would be if they're going to be out there lobbying for legal changes across a range of issues, and they do tend to think of themselves as experts on everything, right? It doesn't matter what the crime is. All of a sudden, they know all there is to know about opioid addiction and how you stop it while it's bringing more homicide prosecutions or whatever it is. But here, it's a kind of a weird disconnect where they're happy to just sit back. So I guess I would say, for me, step one would be, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to be the leading lobbyist in your jurisdiction for criminal laws, then you need to lobby for changes when it comes to law, when it comes to a law like this one that is not doing its job. And so they should be at the forefront asking for reforms to how what the use of deadly force policy should be, whether there should be de-escalation requirements, whether training needs to be revamped. Like, they should be out there saying it instead of just these press conferences where it's, again, I'm really sorry to the family, because that's not what they do in the other spaces. And then I would say, if they don't feel comfortable doing that in the policing space, then why are they doing it in every other area of law where they do step forward? And so I guess, to me, every time it happens, that's the thing that stands out in the sharpest contrast to me, is all of a sudden their hands are tied and they can't do any more, but that's not how it would be in the case of other crimes. And so I would say one shift is going to be either you're the leader on every law enforcement issue or you're not. And if you are, then this should be one that you care deeply about. And if frankly, of all of the ones that they deal with, this is the most in their wheelhouse because they are dealing with the police all the time. They are really looking at these shootings and dissecting them and seeing all the spaces in which things could have come out differently. So if there was a space where they had the expertise to really talk about where policy should go, ironically, this is the one. And this is the one where they should be leaders, and they're not. And so I do think there's a cowardice to standing behind the microphone and saying how sorry they are that their hands are just tied because the law won't let them do otherwise.
You know, an interesting point just that you just made me think about is think about Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania AG, when the child sexual abuse cases against priests came to his attention. Everything was time barred by the statute of limitations. So he did an extraordinary investigation and an investigative report because he was not able to prosecute under the laws, but he actually took this incredibly, I think, this incredible stand that has really changed the conversation nationally around an issue that people were saying, I can't do it. So it's a great point.
Even he has refused to have that same type of attention
I agree.
to issues of police brutality. Give me just a minute on this case.
Yeah, please.
It's a horrible murder. And I have traveled all over the country and met these families. And I'm not saying we're doing this now, but we often talk about and say names of victims of police violence. And to us, they register in a place in our mind as news stories, as trending topics. But for other people, these are fathers, sons, daughters, mothers, sisters, brothers. Stephon Clark was a father. He was a beloved son, grandson. He had a brother who was his best friend, who has literally almost driven himself to a place of insanity fighting for justice for his brother. Stephon Clark was shot at 20 times in the backyard of his grandmother's home. And he was wanted, police believe, on the suspicion of breaking a car window. That was the crime that they never even determined if that was him. There was no evidence that was never finalized that was even him. And for that crime, they dispatched helicopters, officers all over Sacramento for a broken window. And when they arrived chasing him into the backyard of his grandmother's home, they shot at him 20 times, 7 of those bullets hitting them, most of them in his back. That evening, I was watching closely. They said he had a gun. Then they admitted it was not a gun and said it was a tire iron that they thought he may have used to break the windows. Then 3 days later, they admitted there was no tire iron, that he had no weapon, no objects at all, no gun, no knife, nothing, that he was completely unarmed and nonviolent, and he was wanted for something that might have gotten him a ticket or citation if he was even the person who did it. So how someone could fire 20 shots at an unarmed, nonviolent person, and then both the district attorney, Anne Marie Schubert, and the attorney general refuse to press any charges is not as simple rather as it looks. It's complex. It's easy for us, again, to go to our gut reaction of racism or bigotry or white supremacy, and all those things are factors in this case and other cases, but they're not the primary determinants. First and foremost, there are multiple Supreme Court decisions that fundamentally make it legal for police to do what they did in this case. You must read and study Tennessee versus Garner and really get to the root of Tennessee versus Garner. And if you don't know that case, Edward Garner was a 90-pound, 13-year-old boy who was shot in the back by police in Tennessee all the way back in 1974. And his father fought for justice for his 13-year-old son for a decade. And when the Supreme Court finally decided on Tennessee versus Garner, if you go back and look at news clippings in 1983 and 84, civil rights groups were celebrating it as an enormous victory Because it says, and it's actually beautiful. If you read the majority decision, it says you cannot shoot a fleeing felon, someone suspected of a felony. It says even if they've committed murder, you don't have the right to do that, that use of force does not then grant you the right to shoot somebody. And everybody's like, we won. Well, it took about 10 years for police departments all the way to the mid-90s to find 2 sentences in that beautiful decision, Tennessee versus Garner, that said you can't shoot people like this unless you're afraid for the safety of yourself or the community. And that little phrase there has been exploited because then it just fundamentally gets to, well, what did the officer think or believe in that moment, which you can basically never dispute unless you have a recording of them sometime later saying, I wasn't afraid and shot for the fun of it or the hell of it, unless you can somehow prove that, which is almost impossible. And then you have to look at Graham versus Connor, which is a fascinating case of a man who was going into a diabetic coma, who was brutally abused by police in Charlotte, North Carolina. Beaten, mangled, passed out from the diabetic coma he was going into, and then when police were done assaulting him, they literally dropped him off in the front yard of his home because they suspected that he had just robbed a convenience store when he had actually just ran in there to buy himself an orange juice because he felt himself about to pass out. They didn't believe his story. Literally, he ran into the convenience store, grabbed the orange juice, but there were multiple people in line, and so he decided to just put the orange juice right on the counter and left and got in the car with his friend, and they started driving off, and the police pulled them over, and the police said, we think you just robbed the store. And they beat Graham senseless. And so he sued on the local level, the state level, and all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, what they did to him was ugly, but they did it based on what they thought the circumstances were at the time. And the case basically says you can't hold police responsible for the actual facts that they didn't know. They can only be held responsible on what they thought they knew. And since he thought Graham was a brutal man who had just robbed a convenience store, instead of the reality that he was a diabetic about to pass out, you can't hold him responsible for the facts. In those 2 cases, police departments all over America are training their officers on how to operate within the narrow confines of those laws. Make it nearly impossible to convict the most egregious officers in the worst cases imaginable. There's that. And those 2 cases are essential. I need to speak just for a moment about training because for years I was a huge advocate for more training from police. And listen, they need more training, yes. But I lost my faith in training being the answer that solves this issue with Stephon Clark because I see police officers every single day, particularly when white supremacists actually physically shoot up places, schools, churches, synagogues, and others, shoot up places and see police officers with patience and grace take time. It could be a movie theater, it could be a school, and it could be an armed shooter with an arsenal of weapons. And police in same departments, in the exact same departments that are brutal to black men and women, then find a way to take their time and peacefully, non-violently arrest people with an arsenal of weapons who just actually killed people. If Stephon Clark had just gotten the peace and patience that mass shooters get every single day, he'd be alive right now and we wouldn't even know his name. At the most, he would have gotten a ticket or a day in jail. So it seems like police are able to call on their training when actual shooters are white, but seem to forget their training when the people they're looking at are unarmed and black or other people of color. And so I'm concerned about that. And then lastly, in Sacramento, and this gets to the root of your book, Rachel, in Sacramento, the district attorney there, Anne Marie Schubert, the #1 contributor to her campaigns for district attorneys are police office unions. Just in this last cycle alone, she received nearly $450,000 from multiple police unions. The largest contribution to her campaign came literally 2 days after Stephon Clark was killed from the police union. So tell me, what's the likelihood that she's going to charge any officer when it's disputable that she would even be in office without their financial support? And then something that's tricky but connected to this, I do think it's somewhat unfair even to expect most district attorneys to hold police officers accountable. They work with them every single day. Just imagine this scenario. Think of the most cherished loved one in your life. So for me, it could be my wife, my children, my mother. And say your most cherished loved one committed a horrible crime, but they put you in charge of the investigation. It's going to be a weird investigation. So you put me in charge of the investigation of my loved ones. Depending on who it is, evidence might go missing. I am doubting I'm going to charge my most cherished loved one with the harshest crimes available. And if there's a path to me not charging my mother at all, I'm going to look for that path and find it. And so prosecutors and police officers, they're not even left hand and right hand. They're like fingers on the same hand. And they literally work together every single day of the week. They are partners in the same endeavor. And so it's difficult to ever expect a partner to hold another partner responsible. It's like expecting police officers to investigate themselves. Those investigations just keep not turning anything up. So weird. And that's what we get with the district attorney, Anne Marie Schubert. These are her funders, her professional partners. She's not going to do it. And the law is on her side. I'll close the loop with this. I talked to a member of the jury in the case of the shooting death of Philando Castile. And that jury decided unanimously not to convict that officer. And it was a brilliant, progressive, mixed-race jury. And I spoke to one of the jurors who told me in tears, Sean, basically Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor was explained to us in meticulous detail. And what we were told is if the officer told us he feared for his life, we can't convict him. She said everybody on the jury wanted to convict the officer, but they felt that the law constrained them, prevented them from doing so. So here you get charges were brought, a great jury was formed, and then that great jury still found 12-0, a verdict of not guilty, in a case that was on Facebook Live. And so even when you have a good district attorney, even when you have a balanced jury, these two Supreme Court case laws and some others are still really working against us.
Thank you both so much. We don't have a ton of time for questions, but we've got about 10 minutes. So if anyone wants to ask a question, raise your hand. And we've got a couple of folks here who will get to you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Andrea Lee. I'm a 1L at BC Law. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on Kamala Harris?
Sure. We just spoke about Kamala Harris, and I framed it like this, and I mean this sincerely. I really love Senator Kamala Harris. I even really love presidential candidate Kamala Harris. And if I can find a way to use one of those Men in Black tools to forget Attorney General Kamala Harris and District Attorney Kamala Harris, I would be supporting Kamala Harris. But it requires me to have a degree of amnesia of the 30 years she spent as an official in the justice system, often at odds with families impacted by police brutality, at odds with advocates for justice reform. She literally blocked consistently reforms that people were fighting for, statewide reforms, local reforms. And so if I look at her presidential platform, I love it. And so either one of two things have happened. Either she has evolved more than anybody in the history of evolution, or in order to present herself as a progressive, she has said she now stands for things that she never stood for in her entire legal career. And so when you investigate political candidates, see if they have an actual history of fighting for the things they say they now really care about. And so for Kamala Harris, I'm just speaking of criminal justice reform, she has a history of fighting for many wonderful quality things, but I'm stuck on her actual history when it comes to criminal justice. But I do love her platform and positions, and I love some of the people she's putting on her team. So I say that to say I'm skeptical, I'm conflicted, but I'm glad of the direction she's moving in.
I'll just add one little wrinkle to that, which is that I think people can learn over time, and I think that it is true that this kind of progressive, we were talking about this at lunch, it's not really fair to judge her by the progressive prosecutor metrics of today, because a lot of this stuff really is kind of newish. On the other hand, she does get to characterize how she acted previously and would she do anything differently. And I'm still waiting to hear about some of the things that she would have done differently now knowing what she knows now. And I think that would be a better indicator than just stamping a label, I was a progressive prosecutor. I think whenever you hear anybody say that, I would just urge you to find out what they mean when they say it, like what their actual policy positions are, because they have found it to be politically expedient now, particularly in Democratic primaries, to be progressive for those purposes. But you got to see what's behind that label, because too many people are using it now in a way that it's almost going to become, I think, meaningless.
Let me add one extra layer. It is an exaggeration to frame her time as district attorney or attorney general. It's like if we were grading A, B, C, D, and F. She was not an F. She was not a D. She was like a C on a lot of issues, and some issues she's really horrible on, and there are other examples during that time that she was good on. So it's all of us have this gut reaction to throw someone away and not look at the nuance of her record or of any person's record. I would just encourage you and all of us to look at all of those records, and I agree with Rachel. People do evolve, but there are a lot of questions there. And we've noticed a lot of people running for district attorney and prosecutor have adopted the language of change, but don't have the heart for it. There is someone in the room right now, Tiffany Caban, who's right over here. She's a public defender in Queens, and she's running for a district attorney in Queens, and she's an actual reformer whose entire history is going in that direction. And I encourage you, the number of people who vote in DA's elections in all of our boroughs, it's humiliating. I don't even think most law students at NYU are voting in those elections. It's low everywhere. I'm talking about 2 to 3% of New Yorkers vote for their district attorney. And so we have a great opportunity to vote a reformer in Queens, and I'd love for us to do that.
Hi, so this is a follow-up to what you guys were just discussing, and I'm curious what are some of the prerequisite actions or experiences you look for or expect in the type of person who your organization would support for election as a progressive prosecutor? And I ask this because many lawyers, especially future lawyers in this room, want to beat the system from inside, but get swallowed by it. And I guess, in other words, what steps do you take, what steps does your organization take in order to ensure that you're actually supporting somebody who is progressive, or is it just that they proclaim to be such?
Sure. So we have our organization is called the Real Justice PAC, and we're the first organization like that that helps endorse, support, and even manage the political campaigns for district attorneys candidates across the country. And we learned quickly, just as a bit of public education, why there aren't other groups to do this. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, because each city has different campaign finance laws, campaign organization laws, each state. So each campaign we get involved in, we have to register there as a political action group. We have to educate ourselves on the laws, and it is hard. It's why most groups fighting for justice are nonprofits. But consequently, they're not allowed to get involved in these campaigns, which is a real problem. So we decided that we wanted to be involved with these campaigns. We evaluate in each city and state that we get involved in. We evaluate all of the candidates. We interview the candidates. We meet them. We look at their records. We have a very exhaustive questionnaire that we have all of the potential candidates complete. Here's a great example. In Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby ran for re-election as state's attorney in Baltimore. And I am friends with Marilyn Mosby, but we chose not to endorse or support her because of a couple of the positions she had that we found from her questionnaire. And it was difficult for her to not get her. She was perplexed that we didn't endorse her. It was hard. She eventually won her campaign anyway, but a couple of her values were at odds with our values. And so we didn't do the endorsement. We have learned how to detect someone claiming a progressive position and to compare that just with their professional history. And we have grown to really appreciate public defenders who understand a very different side of the justice system, who still care a great deal about victims and safety and rights, but understand the system from a very different angle. I would say that when we are interviewing and filtering a candidate, a public defender starts out in a different position for me than, say, a lifelong prosecutor. Larry Krasner, for instance, who we helped elect in Philadelphia, was literally a lifelong civil rights attorney. He was the attorney for Black Lives Matter in Philadelphia, and now he's district attorney. And so we put all of our candidates through a rigorous gauntlet before we endorse them. But we have supported several career prosecutors who convinced us that they were reformers trapped in the system, constrained by the system, either because they didn't have the authority to change it, but that they desperately wanted to and were trying to rise up through the ladder to change it from the inside out.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. Before I thank Sean and Rachel, I want to remind folks of a couple things. First, James Foreman Jr. will actually be here next week, who wrote Locking Up Our Own. He's a terrific law professor, writer, and worth seeing. He'll be here at 4 p.m. on Thursday, March 14th, for an event with the Brennan Center. You can register on the Brennan Center website. Second, Rachel's book, Prisoner of Politics, is on sale near the exit of this room. Rachel's going to sign books over here, and I will tell you, it's sold out on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, so you got to get it here. That's my plug for you, Rachel. And finally, I just want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Sean King and Rachel Barkow for this incredible discussion.